The wind carried a soft rustle of dried grass, sweeping over the vast, barren fields. It was an old wind, familiar and weary, much like Eli Ward himself. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting a pale golden light over the stretch of empty land that seemed to go on forever. Eli stood at the edge of his small ranch, hands resting on the worn fence, his eyes tracing the distant mountains. His life had become a series of endless days, each one fading into the next, as quiet and motionless as the landscape before him. The town of Mill Creek had been his home for as long as he could remember. The dusty roads, the creaking wooden buildings, and the faces of people who had watched him grow up were all too familiar. But familiarity didn't bring comfort. It only amplified the isolation that had crept into his soul after the loss. Eli hadn't always been this way, silent and withdrawn. There was a time when he had dreams as wide as the sky, when laughter had filled the air and love had been the foundation of his every step. But that was before Clara. Clara had been his heart, the kind of woman who could light up the darkest corners of a man's life with just a glance. She had been full of life, full of promises. They had shared everything: hopes, dreams, even fears. She was the one who had shown him the beauty in the world, the one who made him believe that maybe, just maybe, happiness could last forever. But life had a way of shattering everything. The fire had come without warning, taking Clara with it. The smoke had risen high above the town, the flames licking at the sky as Eli stood helpless, watching it all burn. By the time the fire was out, nothing remained. Nothing but charred earth and a gaping hole where his future once had been. Since that day, Eli had existed, not lived. He had built a wall around his heart, one that no one could penetrate. He worked, he ate, he slept, but it was all done in a mechanical trance. He didn't cry anymore. There were no more tears to shed. The pain had settled into something cold and distant, something that didn't need to be acknowledged anymore. It was simply there, like the silence that hung over the land, ever present, but never spoken. The people of Mill Creek didn't talk about Clara anymore. They didn't need to. They all knew. They saw the way Eli had withdrawn into himself, how he avoided any kind of human contact. They knew the stories, the whispered condolences that had become nothing more than background noise. In a town this small, nothing was ever truly private. But they had all stopped offering sympathy. They knew better than to disturb the fragile quiet Eli had built around himself. The mornings were the hardest. It was when the stillness of the world felt most suffocating. It was in these moments, as the sun rose over the horizon, that Eli would remember the way Clara had laughed, softly at first, then louder as the joy bubbled over. Her laughter had been the music of his world. Now all he had was the silence. Today, however, felt different. There was a subtle shift in the air, something almost imperceptible, but it was there. Eli couldn't explain it, but he felt it deep within him. Perhaps it was the way the light seemed a little brighter or how the wind had changed direction, carrying with it a promise that someone, was about to enter his life again. But he pushed the thought away. Hope had only led to disappointment, and Eli was done with that. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, a figure appeared on the edge of the town, just where the road curved and disappeared into the horizon. It was a woman. Eli's breath caught in his throat as he watched her, unsure of what he was feeling: curiosity, fear, hope. The figure moved slowly, as if savoring every step, her silhouette outlined against the fading sun. And just like that, something inside him stirred, something long buried. He couldn't name it, but it felt like the smallest flicker of life, a spark that had been dormant for far too long. The wind shifted again, and the woman's gaze met his for the briefest of moments. In that instant, Eli knew she wasn't like the others. She wasn't here to pity him, to make him talk about his grief. No, there was something different about her, something that made him feel, for the first time in years, like maybe the world hadn't forgotten him after all. And so, as the woman's figure grew nearer, Eli stood there motionless, a man caught between the past and the future, unsure if he was ready to face what was coming, but knowing, deep down, that he had no choice. The woman's presence lingered in Eli's mind long after she had passed. Her image was like a wisp of smoke, fleeting but undeniable. He found himself returning to the memory of her silhouette against the setting sun, the way the evening light played across her features. She had the kind of quiet strength that Eli hadn't seen in years, not since Clara. Eli spent the following days with his usual routine, checking the fences, feeding the cattle, tending to the land, but there was an unfamiliar restlessness within him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, like a door had cracked open just a little, and the possibility of something more had entered. The next morning, as he walked into the town's general store, his boots sounding louder than usual on the wooden floors, he saw her again. She was standing by the counter, scanning a row of old tin cans, her back turned to him. Eli hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach or keep his distance. But something inside him stirred, pushing him forward. The bell above the door jingled softly as Eli entered, and the woman turned around at the sound. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to fall away. There was a recognition there, something unspoken but understood. She didn't say anything at first, and neither did Eli. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was as though the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. She spoke first, her voice low but steady. "You're Eli Ward, aren't you?" There was no pity in her tone, no judgment. Just an observation, like she was stating a simple fact. Eli nodded, unsure of what to say. "I am. I've heard of you," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You've been here a while, I imagine." Eli shifted uncomfortably, trying to find words that wouldn't sound too sharp, too defensive. "Too long," he muttered, his voice rough. He instantly regretted it, but the words had already slipped out. She didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as though studying him with a quiet curiosity. "I can't imagine staying in one place that long," she said thoughtfully. "I think I'd get bored." Eli's lips twitched at the corners, though he quickly suppressed the gesture. The way she spoke, so matter-of-fact, so unbothered by the weight of the past, struck him as strange. Most people tiptoed around him, afraid of his silence, afraid of the darkness that lingered in his eyes. But she didn't seem intimidated. She seemed curious, and that made Eli feel something he hadn't felt in years, vulnerable. The woman noticed his hesitation and gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm Rose," she introduced herself, offering him a hand. "I'm just passing through, but I've heard Mill Creek isn't the most exciting place. Thought I'd take a look around." Eli glanced down at her hand, then up at her face. There was no urgency in her offer, no expectation. Just a simple gesture. He took her hand, feeling the weight of it, the warmth of a stranger who wasn't trying to fix him, wasn't trying to heal his wounds. She was simply there. "I'm Eli," he said again, his voice quieter this time, as if the name was something he hadn't said in a long while. "Eli, huh?" she said, her eyes thoughtful. "You don't look like the kind of man who stays in one place. What's kept you here all these years?" The question caught him off guard. He had expected her to ask something simple, like where he was from or what he did for a living. But this question was different. It was a question that made him confront himself, made him think about the life he had built here, the life that had been shaped by loss, by pain, by silence. Eli shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before he looked back up at her. "Sometimes you stay because you don't know where else to go," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Sometimes it's easier to stay where the world knows you, even if that world is empty." Rose didn't respond immediately. She didn't try to offer comfort, didn't fill the silence with words that felt forced. Instead, she simply nodded, as though she understood more than she let on. After a moment, she stepped back, her eyes meeting his one last time. "Well, Eli, maybe it's time you got out of this place," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Maybe it's time you stopped letting it define you." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in years, Eli felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long while, the faintest glimmer of hope. The days following Rose's visit were a strange mix of quiet and chaos for Eli. The quiet of his daily routines was interrupted by her presence, by the gentle pull of something he couldn't quite name. But even more disruptive was the quiet in his mind, the unsettling stillness that had taken root in his soul ever since Clara's death. He kept seeing Rose's face in his thoughts, the way she had looked at him that day in the general store. It wasn't pity, nor was it curiosity. It was something else. It was understanding, as if she had seen something in him, something he hadn't even realized was there. And that thought, that simple acknowledgement, unsettled him. For years, Eli had been running from his past, from the memories of Clara, from the loss that had torn his world apart. He had buried himself in his work, in the routine of the ranch, in the silence. He hadn't allowed himself the luxury of feeling anything too deeply. To feel was to open old wounds. To feel was to face the truth of what he had lost. But Rose was different. She didn't push him to talk. She didn't demand anything from him. But there was something in her quiet presence that made him realize just how long he had been hiding from his own heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of purple and orange, Eli found himself outside again, standing at the edge of the ranch. The wind had picked up, and the air carried the scent of rain. There was a heaviness in the atmosphere, a tension that made Eli feel like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't quite understand. The thought of Rose lingered in his mind, and with it, the thought of Clara. It had been years since he allowed himself to remember her like this, vivid, alive, her laugh echoing in his ears, her touch warm against his skin. The memories hit him like a wave, overwhelming and relentless, and for the first time in years, Eli allowed himself to feel it all, the sorrow, the guilt, the love. He didn't try to push it away this time. He let it wash over him, let the grief take its rightful place in his heart. As he stood there, lost in the past, he heard footsteps approaching. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The sound was too familiar, the soft tread of boots on the dry earth. Rose. She came to stand beside him, her presence like a steady anchor in the storm of his emotions. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, watching the sunset together, letting the silence between them settle into something comfortable, something unspoken. Finally, it was Rose who broke the stillness. "You've been carrying this weight for a long time, haven't you?" Her voice was quiet, but there was a depth to it, as if she had known all along. Eli didn't answer at first. He couldn't. The words were caught in his throat, and for a moment, he was afraid to speak them aloud. But the weight of her gaze, the understanding in her eyes, pushed him to face the truth. He turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze, and finally spoke. "I don't know how to let go," he admitted, the words raw, as though they had been buried for too long. "I don't know how to stop mourning her. Clara, she was everything." Rose nodded, her expression soft but unwavering. "I know," she said, her voice like a balm on his open wounds. "But she wouldn't want you to live in the past. She would want you to live, to find peace." Eli's breath hitched at her words. They were simple, but they carried the weight of a truth he had never been able to accept, that Clara, in all her love, would never want him to be trapped by his grief. She would want him to move forward, to find joy again, even if it felt impossible. "I don't know if I can," Eli whispered, the doubt lingering in his voice. He felt broken, unworthy of the kind of healing Rose was offering him. Rose stepped closer, her hand brushing against his arm in a gesture so gentle that it felt like a promise. "You don't have to do it alone," she said quietly. "You never have to do it alone." For the first time in a long while, Eli allowed himself to believe that. He wasn't sure how he would find peace, or what that even looked like, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a spark that could grow if he allowed it. The days that followed Rose's words were quiet, but there was a shift in Eli. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Each morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, he no longer felt the crushing weight of solitude pressing against him as it once had. The silence of his ranch, once a constant companion, now seemed to hold something else, a kind of anticipation, as if the land itself was waiting for him to step forward. Eli had never been one to share his feelings, to confide in others. He had spent years building walls around his heart, ensuring no one could get too close. But Rose was different. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't demand that he open up, and yet there was something about her, about the quiet way she understood him, that made him feel as though he could. Every day, she came by, sometimes bringing a cup of coffee, sometimes just standing beside him as they worked together. There was no pressure, no rush to talk. They simply existed in the same space, and somehow that was enough. It was as though her presence itself was a kind of quiet healing, stitching the broken pieces of him together without him even realizing it. It was during one of those days, as they worked side by side on the fence, that Eli realized just how much he had changed. The work was hard, the sun high in the sky, beating down on them both, but for the first time in a long while, Eli felt his muscles working not out of routine, but out of something else, a sense of purpose. His mind was no longer preoccupied with the weight of the past. It was focused on the here and now. He looked over at Rose as she handed him a hammer, and for a brief moment, their hands brushed. It was a simple touch, fleeting, but it sent a ripple through Eli's chest. He didn't pull away. Instead, he met her gaze, and this time, there was no barrier between them. There was no shadow of his grief, no wall built from years of pain. In that moment, there was just Eli, and there was Rose, standing together, side by side. As the days passed, their quiet bond deepened. Eli found himself sharing more with her, not about the past, but about the future. He spoke of things he had once dreamed of, things he had buried long ago. He talked about the land, about the animals, about how much he had once loved working the fields with Clara. He spoke of hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. But the words came easily now, flowing from him in a way that surprised him. It was a slow process, the healing. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't without its moments of doubt. There were days when the weight of the past would creep up on him, reminding him of the life he had lost, of the woman who was no longer there to share it with him. But those days became fewer, and the good days, days filled with light and laughter, days spent working alongside Rose, began to outnumber the bad ones. And then came the storm. The wind picked up one afternoon, dark clouds swirling in the sky. The distant thunder rumbled, warning of the storm that was about to hit. Eli and Rose had been working on the barn when the first drops of rain began to fall, light at first, but quickly turning into a downpour. "Better get inside," Rose called out over the wind, her hair sticking to her face as she turned toward the cabin. Eli hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the sky, watching as the storm approached with the ferocity of a wild thing. But there was something about the storm that called to him. It was like the storm inside him, long held, waiting to be released. "Not yet," he said, his voice steady, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think I'll stay out here a little longer." Rose didn't argue. She simply nodded, her face softening with understanding. She knew that sometimes, the only way to face the storm was to stand in it. Eli stood there, letting the rain soak him to the bone. The wind howled around him, but he stood firm, his chest rising and falling with each breath. The storm was a part of him now, just like the grief, just like the love he had once known. But this time it didn't crush him. This time it reminded him that he was still standing, that he was still alive. As the storm raged around him, Eli closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over him. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was here, in this moment, with all its pain and beauty. And for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. The days following the storm felt like a turning point for Eli. The rain had washed the earth clean, but it had also stirred something within him. The rawness of the storm, the way it had swept through everything, leaving no trace of the old calm, mirrored the storm inside him. He had stood in it. He had let it soak into his bones. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel as though he were drowning in his grief. He felt alive. But the storm didn't just pass. It lingered in the stillness that followed, in the quiet moments when he found himself alone with his thoughts. There was something that still held him back. Something that needed to be faced before he could truly let go of the past. Rose had been a steady presence, always there with quiet support, never pushing, never rushing him. But even she could see that something had changed. Eli was no longer the same man who had come to Mill Creek all those years ago, lost and broken. There was a flicker of hope in him now, a light that had begun to shine through the cracks in his heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Eli found himself standing in the field once more, looking at the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of red and gold, but this time, the beauty of the scene didn't escape him. He saw it, he felt it, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel something more than sorrow. Rose had left for town, and the ranch was quiet, as it always was when she wasn't around. Eli hadn't planned on being out here for long, but something drew him to the place where he and Clara had once dreamed of building their life together. The spot where they had imagined a future filled with laughter and love. A future that had been ripped away in an instant. His fingers traced the rough wood of the fence, and for a moment, the memories came rushing back. The sound of Clara's voice, the way she had smiled when they first moved here, the way they had talked about growing old together. All of it felt so distant, so unreal, like it belonged to someone else. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't running anymore. He had spent so many years running from the memory of Clara, from the pain of her loss. But that wasn't the man he wanted to be anymore. He wanted to live. He wanted to feel again. And to do that, he needed to forgive himself. "I'm sorry, Clara," he whispered into the wind. The words felt like they had been waiting to be spoken for a long time, though they had never seemed enough before. "I couldn't save you, but I'm going to live. I'm going to find a way to live again." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't some cathartic outpouring of emotion. It was simple, quiet, but it was enough. Eli had finally said the words that had been trapped inside him, the words that had held him captive in his grief. He had forgiven himself for not being able to save her. He had forgiven himself for the guilt that had haunted him every day since. The wind shifted, and Eli felt a warmth that wasn't just from the setting sun. It was something deeper, something real. The weight of his past had not disappeared, but it no longer held the same power over him. He had come to terms with it. He had accepted it. As he stood there, the sky fading into twilight, Eli knew that he was ready to move forward. He wasn't the man he had been before Clara. He was different now, wiser, more at peace, and ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. The days after Eli's reckoning were different, calmer, yet more alive. He had spent years walking through the motions, haunted by the past, weighed down by the grief he had carried like a heavy cloak. But now, there was light in his chest, an open space where the shadows had once lived. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was breathing freely. He had returned to the land with a new sense of purpose. Every task, every chore felt different. His hands still moved with the same practiced skill, but now there was a rhythm to it, a sense of meaning. It was as if the earth itself had recognized his change, welcoming him back with open arms. The soil beneath his feet felt solid again, not like a reminder of what had been lost, but a foundation for something new. And through it all, Rose was there, quiet, steady, and understanding. She never pushed him, never tried to make him move faster than he was ready. She simply allowed him to heal at his own pace, offering a kind word when he needed it, standing beside him in silence when the weight of his past grew heavy again. She had become more than just a companion. She was a reminder that the world could still be kind, that trust and love weren't things to be feared. One evening, as the last traces of sunlight painted the sky in shades of pink and purple, Eli found himself once again standing at the edge of the ranch. Rose was with him, just as she had been so many times before, and together, they watched the sunset in comfortable silence. The evening air was cool, and the world felt at peace. "You've come a long way, Eli," Rose said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of unspoken meaning. "I can see it. You're not the same man who came here." Eli didn't answer at first. He just stood there, taking in the sight before him. The vast, open land, the horizon stretching far beyond his sight. The sun was setting, but it wasn't the end of the day. It was simply a part of the cycle, the promise that tomorrow would come. "I'm not," Eli said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm not who I was before, but I'm learning. I'm still learning." Rose smiled, a small, knowing smile that spoke volumes more than words could say. "That's all any of us can do, isn't it? Keep learning."